Hi, good evening, everyone. This is Rebecca Smith-Aldridge. I'm the Executive Director of the Mid-Hudson Library System, and I think many of you got to semi-meet Casey during the audio checks as before we started our recording here tonight. Casey's our Library Sustainability Coordinator, who serves as a library development consultant to our 66 member libraries here in the Mid-Hudson Library System. Myself, I've had about 20 years of experience here at the Mid-Hudson Library System, serving in somewhat of a consultant role to our member libraries for much of that time. That includes helping libraries write policy, interpret how law influences policy, and helping clean up challenges that may arise when there's not policy in place that should be, or policy's been misconstrued, or hasn't been clear enough for staff to carry things out in a way that mitigated a problem perhaps that's arisen at the library. And Casey, before he came to Mid-Hudson, was a library director. So he's got real world experience of applying policy and finding out the pros and cons of how policies might be written. So our goal here today is to give you perhaps a fighting chance, I think, at fulfilling your role as a public library trustee in terms of your responsibility of policy maker. And our goal tonight will be to give you some of the basic tenets that I think serve as a solid foundation to help you in the role of policymaking on your library board. There's a joke that's gone around for a long time about policy making on library boards, that on your policy committee, you want the most pessimistic people because you have to think about the worst case scenario in a lot of cases when you're writing policy to protect the library's assets and reputation. So in order to help you do that work, because of course we don't have time to go over every single policy that your library may need to have, we will give you a list and an overview of those policies for sure. But more importantly, we want to give you, again, that solid foundation so that when you are posed with challenges or tough issues, you're not quite sure what to do with a policy that you're confronted with, you've got some things to fall back on. Those foundational documents like the Library Bill of Rights and the core values of librarianship. And we're going to talk a bit about trustee ethics as well, because a big part of core values and ethics is about the behavior of trustees and our ability to lead our libraries forward while protecting the reputation and the high level of trust that our communities have in our public libraries. So the whole idea of policy making, this is certainly an introductory level webinar for you this evening. As many of you know, this is the first year we've converted our entire trustee education series online. Normally we're in our auditorium in Poughkeepsie with you in person or at a member library out in the 5 counties. And so this is new for us and perhaps new for you as well, but I bet you've gotten some practice before tonight in being in an online meeting setting. So hopefully the controls of the program are clear to you, and please feel free to use, as Casey said, either the chat box or the questions box if you have questions and comments throughout our time together here this evening. We will be pausing here and there to answer the questions that come up as we go along. And normally when we see you in person, we like to give you a complimentary copy of the Handbook for Library Trustees of New York State. This is sometimes referred to as the Trustee Bible, sometimes lovingly and jokingly, but it's true because it's really the only publication out there for library trustees in New York to give you a fighting chance to be confident and comfortable in understanding your role. If you'd like a print copy, we're still going to give you a complimentary copy of this. It's of course available online for free if you'd like to read it in an online format or a PDF document. But if you're like me and you really like print and you want to hold it in your hands, you can email Joan Kay in our business office. Her email address is on the screen, jkay@midhudson.org. Let her know you came to the workshop this evening and use this workshop code TE92020, and she'll put a print copy of the handbook in the delivery to your library to your attention. So in that book, you'll find a whole chapter related to policymaking and the role of the library trustee in policymaking. And we know in that book that it is perhaps the most difficult part of a trustee's job. When you think about all the creative work you get to do in your role as a library trustee, perhaps you get to work on a funding referendum or a building issue that requires some thought and research. Policymaking takes, concentration, consideration of issues, sometimes some research to delve into how other libraries have handled things in the past. But most importantly, it requires an open mind and a thoughtful study, that you're willing to put in some time to really understand issues and how they relate back to everyone's experience with the library and everyone's access to information, not perhaps just a singular case of someone complaining or a particular incident that's happened at the library. We never want to write policy around one incident or one person, and that can be a challenge sometimes. We really want to make sure that our policies reflect the mission of our library and are helping to bring it to life, and that we're really respecting the community that we serve, as well as our library workers as we write our library policy. So one of the clear things about policies and policy making in libraries is that it's not technically a policy unless it's written down and board approved. So you may have practices at your library or the way that things have always been done, but sometimes if they haven't been vetted and approved by the board, they're certainly not going to stand up to legal challenge. And so as you consider what policies you already have done, and we'll talk a bit about how to assess that, this is something to be very serious about in tracking when policies at your library have been reviewed and when they were initially approved, so you can track perhaps how old they are in case it's a legal issue that's evolved since the last time the board visited it. So this idea of critical legal protection is a big part of policy making. And we certainly don't say that to make you nervous, just to point out that policies in your library, in some ways you can consider them micro laws. We certainly have laws made by the feds and the New York State, and we have regulation that influences libraries. But when we talk about library boards as policymakers, it's really like you're making law for your library. It can't, conflict with laws that hierarchically outweigh your ability to make law. You can't have laws that undermine laws from the state and federal level. But for the purposes of managing the library, library policy approved by the board becomes micro law of the library that your library director relies on to carry out the business of the library in a day-to-day fashion and to ensure that the values of your library board are enforced when it comes to the management of the personnel of the library and the management of the financial assets of the library, which have been entrusted to you, the library board. So no small thing, this role of policy making, but you've got some excellent guidance out there to help you with this, and you've got plenty of samples of policies that have been written by others, legal counsel, as well as a really wonderful group of professionals here at the Mid-Hudson Library System. Not that I'm saying Casey and I are wonderful, we do our best, but you've got a great number of library directors and boards throughout our system who are willing to share the legwork they've already done, so we don't all have to reinvent the wheel, which makes, I think, the Mid-Hudson Library System a very strong system to be a part of. So we're going to get started here with talking about the Library Bill of Rights. And this is my reminder to myself to remind you that you've been emailed a handout packet from Kirsten Kruger on our staff. I think it came in earlier today. But this is a PDF handout that you might have on your screen, or maybe you printed it out for yourself. And you'll notice as we go through the slides this evening, I'll reference that handout packet. So this is the first example of that, where you see at the bottom left-hand corner, see page 1 of your handout packet. If you didn't get that, Casey just put a link to it in the chat box. You can click on it and have that in front of you to follow along. The Library Bill of Rights is a document that sounds pretty cool, right? A Bill of Rights specific to libraries, and it's really what I consider a core or origin document in our profession. It's something that Casey and I and some of the directors on the line here learned about in library school when we got our degrees to learn how to be quote unquote masters of library science. So it's really a foundational document that shapes the thinking of libraries and has shaped the thinking of policymaking in libraries for decades in our country. country. And really, the public library model in America is uniquely American. It's very much tied to some of the tenets of our Constitution and the idea of equality in our country. And it's really the reason I think that libraries are often called the cornerstone of democracy and have some of the highest trust levels of any public or private institutions in our country. And it's really, I think, critical to have reviewed this document when you start thinking about the policy issues that come up in your library board. Maybe it's related to collection development or your meeting room access. And we all have to go back and remind ourselves the library is for everyone in the community, not just people who can pay to come through our doors, not just people who have a certain level of education. It's open to all. It's for everyone in our community to walk through that door and utilize resources, information, and the knowledge on our shelves and our databases and available through the technology and the staff in our buildings to make their world a brighter place, possibly to make our world a better place through their efforts. It's a very exciting, I think, proposition to understand the true power of a public library. And given that you've chosen to volunteer your time at the public library, you could have chosen to devote your volunteer time anywhere in your community. You picked the public library. Something tells me you believe that too, that it's the great equalizer. It really is leveling the playing field for many people in our communities who maybe can't afford access to the internet, who can't afford to keep up with their reading habit, who want to explore interesting topics that they maybe can't afford the journal access fees to. We're really creating that open door to knowledge and the wisdom of the world. And that's a very powerful thing these days and something not to be underestimated. So this idea that all materials are accessible to everyone who's interested, that we're not the arbiters of what's appropriate for someone to look at. If they want to learn about it, we're going to help them have access to materials. And this is something that libraries are really on the forefront today as we think about how many paywalls are going up in front of critical research, thought pieces in magazines and newspapers that really everyone should have the right to read and think through and understand. This is something libraries are fighting very hard to retain on behalf of their membership in their libraries, so that all people have equal access to information, not just people who can pay to have access to premium content. And this idea that you should have access to your library and to materials and information regardless of your origin, age, background, or views. It's a very big debate in our profession right now about whether or not libraries are truly neutral, and that's certainly a conversation we can have if you'd like to over a drink or two, but we are certainly nonpartisan. We are designed to be there for anyone who wants to learn about something. We're opening our programs to anyone who wants to come and learn, and providing programs and curating collections that really speak to the interests of our community, regardless of their origin, age, background, or views. And again, it speaks to that egalitarian nature of libraries. So I love this photo of the Canton Public Library out in Ohio. They have this right over their front door that it's open to all. And like I said, that's uniquely American. When you go to other countries, Mexico, China, you will not find that that is the case. They're certainly evolving their public library model so more people can come through the door and have, to some degree, in some countries, unfettered access. In other countries, they're having monitored access where the government is looking over your shoulder or controlling what you have access to. But in America, we truly believe in the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that's manifested in how our public libraries have been designed and built and organized. The other aspects you'll see addressed in the Library Bill of Rights do specifically relate to nonpartisanship of libraries, that we're not aligned with one party or another. And that's very important. And I think that for the few libraries in our system who are still municipal libraries and have boards that are appointed by the politicians, you'll see that even the comptroller opinions, law shaped around municipal public libraries, all cuts the ties to the politics of our communities and really asks for libraries to serve all and not be swayed by one party or another in its policymaking, in its curation of collections, and its arbitration of issues that might come up in your community related to internet access or censorship. We do really want to see libraries challenge censorship. We don't want one particular viewpoint or one particular person dictating what's going to be on the shelves of our libraries and in the database collections of our libraries. Censorship is something that really can be used to manipulate and control, and it's far better for us to have people who know how to think for themselves and can evaluate information for themselves themselves. And so a commitment to information literacy goes hand in hand with challenging censorship to help people evaluate information they're being shown and have access to, so they are able to figure out what is applicable to their life and how to figure out what's factual and what's not. And that's why you have professional library staff that can help patrons navigate the very complicated world of information these days. This also extends beyond your collections into your physical space, and we're certainly challenged by this right now in the era of COVID, but the Bill of Rights calls for equitable access to gathering spaces, and you'll see that libraries have worked very hard to try to retain this in the COVID era. Whether or not you have a meeting space that's large enough to accommodate social distancing needs these days, we know libraries are trying hard to find digital solutions, outdoor solutions, and alternative locations to continue to provide programs in a space that allows communities to come together in a safe way to learn together. And that's certainly a key element as we think through the next few years of our country's history of how we come together and work together for the betterment of all. So the Library Bill of Rights, as I said, foundational origin document, pretty important, and you'll probably find yourself referring back to it when you come up against hard issues related to your meeting room, collection development, internet access. Many of those issues can be perhaps solved, if not steered in a healthy direction with familiarity of the Library Bill of Rights. And the next, I think, large organizing body of information that helps direct how you think about library service and where our values lie is this list of core values of librarianship, which we've also put in your packet for you. But before we dive into those core values and how they might apply to policymaking in your library, we wanted to point out that that list is certainly alphabetized in your packet, but not necessarily contextualized. So Casey and I took a run at contextualizing it for you using this construct of start with why, which some of you have come to other workshops at Mid-Hudson. You may recall me talking about this book in the past because I truly believe it creates a construct for thinking in a way that's very valuable. And as the title indicates, and if you can't read the author's name there, it's Simon Sinek, S-I-N-E-K. He became very famous due to a TED Talk he gave when TED Talks were first becoming very popular. He talks about the importance of starting with why from a business perspective, of how important it is to explain what you're doing for sure, but more importantly, why you're doing what you're doing. And the core values also follow the same kind of construct where we need to consider why we do what we do as libraries. We need to consider how we do what we do. And then there's certainly what we actually do that's valuable to the community and creates outcomes that are positive in people's lives. So we've reorganized the list of core values that you find in your packet along these lines. Which ones speak to why, which ones speak to how, and which ones speak to what we do in libraries. So under why, we find there's two things that clearly fit from the core values list into why we do what we do. And we're starting here with actually the newest core value that's been added to the list from the American Library Association, which is that of sustainability. The libraries are committed to creating sustainable communities and contributing to a balanced community that is not only economically feasible, but also socially equitable and environmentally sound. And finding the balance there is the work of society, of making decisions and learning about the world around us in a way that creates a healthy environment to both live in, to learn in, and to raise our families in, and to live our lives in. So as we think through the importance of libraries and how they contribute to the future world, you have to really stop and think sometimes, why are we doing all this? Why are we building these collections? Why do we have these buildings with stuff and computers for access? It really goes back to that idea of pursuit of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And it's going to be very hard to do those things without a sustainable world within which to do that work. So sustainability as a core value truly does fit this model of why we do what we do. We're all really interested in creating a better world around us for the people that we care about and the people that will come behind us in future generations. Now, Casey's going to tackle our second why.
So if you read the core value for democracy, you'll see it says democracy presupposes an informed citizenry. And that sentence just hits me like a ton of bricks. The idea that this thing that we're trying to do with democracy, where we give people the power to decide who runs our towns, our states, and our federal government is based on the idea that they know what's going on with these people and in their communities and in the states and in the nation, and how the decisions that these folks make and the views that these people have are going to affect them in their household and in the world itself. When we're talking about climate change and global warming, a lot of the decisions that people are making at these high levels are having a huge effect on there. So the library is a bulwark against people who might be marginalized, or even people who just need a little bit more access to information, who maybe don't have the economic abilities to access all the info that's out there. As we discussed, it might be behind paywalls, or it might be a subscription service. The library provides a ton of content and even guidance to help people access this kind of information from experts, and often guidance on how to find the correct information and how to sort out fact from fiction or opinion that might be out there on the internet, or even disinformation. So there's not many other organizations in our communities, or really anywhere, that are set up to provide this kind of access to folks for free. And that's why libraries are one of the cornerstones of democracy. And that's why this core value is so important, and why we put it up in the why section of the core values, why we do all the work that we do in the library.
It's easy to feel, I think, separated from some of these core values when you think of the day-to-day issues of libraries, when we think about getting books into the hands of children and the adults in our community. But when you really look at who was hurting during COVID, when our facilities were shut down and they couldn't get to perhaps the internet connection of the library or the technology of our library, you see very quickly how people can be disenfranchised in our world today. And that really speaks to how we do our work, how we carry out the work of the library, whether it be services, programs, partnerships. How we do this work matters. And so we organize this section of the core values into the how category. We're going to go through each of these. Social responsibility, right? Taking responsibility for the world around you and helping your neighbors. This is truly the only way the world works. And the library really exemplifies that. You yourself personally exemplify that by standing up and being willing to do the work of helping to govern your local public library, taking responsibility for our communities, our neighborhood, and doing so in a way that is fair to all is a big part of how libraries work.
When we talk about access, we're thinking about removing barriers that are in place to people getting access to our library materials or our services. A big one in libraries is economic barriers. Are there costs associated with accessing the library services? There should not be costs with people accessing whatever is in your collection, and that's one of the strengths of the library. But are there hidden costs that you might not be able to overcome easily at the library? Do you need a car to be able to get to your library from many places in your community? Is there a public transit opportunity? Public transit route that will take people to the library? Or do you absolutely just need a car to get there? And then is there another way to try to help people overcome that barrier? We've seen a bunch of libraries now that we have COVID and we can't actually have people in our buildings as safely as we used to be. They've figured out ways to overcome some of those barriers. We also see accessibility. We want to provide equitable access to folks who maybe have other limitations to how they get to and access our materials. We have large print materials that are in place for people who have low vision. We also provide people with materials in languages so that they can actually use them. If you have Spanish-speaking people in your populations, you should have newsletters and other materials that are available so that these people can use the library to improve their lives and enrich their lives.
And the next two on the list are closely tied together. The idea of confidentiality and privacy is extremely tied to intellectual freedom. And so as we think of these two as core values, it becomes very clear that if people feel that they're going to be judged for what they're viewing or reading or listening to at the library or through the library's collection, or they feel that their privacy will be compromised through the library, it would be a barrier to access because they'd be nervous to come to the library to learn about a set sensitive topic, whether it be a personal health issue or a family issue that they're contending with. Perhaps there's an issue of domestic violence, or their child is struggling with a gender issue, whatever it might be. We want people to feel confident that they can come into the library, access information, or be mediated in their access to information by library staff who are respectful of people's privacy and their confidentiality. In New York State, we're lucky we actually have a whole state law that's dedicated to the protection of library patron information. So it's not just a choice in this case in our libraries to protect patron confidentiality, it's actually the law that your staff is called upon to uphold. So this means what a library patron has borrowed at your library, what they viewed on the internet, that's actually protected by New York State law. So for example, if a law enforcement officer, let's say a state trooper, walked through the door and asked your staff to give them a list of everyone that had borrowed a particular book, your library staff could not provide that information without a court order. That would actually have to come from a judge that's considered the issue. Is it a public safety issue or not? And would that information help to mitigate the safety issue that's been identified? So in New York State, we take that issue very seriously. So while your policy making will probably enforce the need for training for staff on that topic, you're not the arbiter of whether or not patron information should be kept confidential or not. New York State law has done that for you. And I think that's super critical to the idea of intellectual freedom, for people to explore ideas that may be uncomfortable or tough, and they want to learn more about it and chew through that issue. It can broaden people's thinking of how the world works around them. But if they feel like they're being prescribed information, or that they're limited in what they can access, it can really close down their world and their ability to critically think through issues and understand the world around them. It also is particularly important for the younger people in our community to be able to explore ideas and learn about things in a comfortable space and a comfortable pace for them, outside perhaps of the formal learning environment of their school day. So intellectual freedom and privacy, it's not age specific, and that's something that's also very unique about New York State law. There's no cap on the age of which patron's confidentiality needs to be respected, which is unique in New York State.
All of the people in our communities have a right to access their library. And so we have to think about our communities and the diversity in our communities and strive to build collections and spaces and services that are both useful to those people and also welcoming to those people. And it can be hard to actually build those spaces and create those spaces if you don't have that kind of perspective on your board or on your staff. So we talk about diversity. We want to try to build that in to the leadership in our library so that we can make sure that the people in our communities feel welcome and can use the library.
The next two are also tied together, service and professionalism, that as all are welcome through our doors, all deserve respect and empathy. So service and professionalism comes in the form of customer service and making sure our library staff have the skills they need, whether it's access to education or practice or training or peer support in the library to make sure they're able to provide the highest quality library service to your community. And you'll find the people that are drawn to library work, they truly have a desire to do good work and do a good job while they do good work. So this commitment to service and professionalism can be reflected in policy when you think about perhaps your travel and conference policy and making sure you're adequately supporting your staff so they're able to access that training that helps them fulfill their role at your library in a way that respects the idea of a commitment to a high level of customer service and professionalism in dealing with the patrons that walk through our door. The last one that you see here, public good, has a very interesting background when you read the history of it and how it ended up on the list of core values. When you first look at it, you just think, it makes you feel like warm and fuzzy, right? The library is a public good. And this is really the idea that it's classified in with the other public goods in our community, from public education to tax-supported highway departments. The idea that if we all chip in together, we can go further than we could otherwise by ourselves. There's also a background related to this issue for ALA, at least, and that there's been in other parts of our country the movement to privatize libraries, which does impinge on some issues that are related to core values. That if your library is being run by a company whose only really outcome they're going for is the bottom line, you can really compromise the public good that should be coming out of our public libraries that we're investing in as taxpayers. So I think that's another way to think about how we do what we do is for all. It's for the public good. And again, I hate to say that warm and fuzzy feeling, but that really is what we're going for here, that the world can be a better place if we all pull together and help all ships rise with the work that we do.
So now we get to the what, and the what is the part that everybody loves talking about. The what is the most visible part of what we do, and it is the most fun. It's when the rubber meets the road. It's what the heck actually happens and what can I do? A lot of us are doers, and this is what we want. We don't like to think so much, and not that we don't like to think about it, but it's hard to think about why we do the stuff and how we do it. It's just let's do it, let's do it, let's do it. So this is the what, and these are the core values that ALA has defined that we thought fit as what's. So education and lifelong learning is obviously an output and an outcome of our library services. Education is a huge deal. Every day we are educating people in our community. We have people who check out tons of James Patterson books, but we also have people who check out tons of nonfiction books, and we're helping people pursue their passions and to make their lives and their families' lives just better in general. A lot of our libraries have stepped up their game in terms of what they're actually offering to folks, because the materials that we offer at the library are a big part and a big tool that people use to actually make their lives better. We have over 3 million items the last time we checked, which was last year when we did our annual reporting, in our catalog, and that has since grown significantly by the libraries who have created more or accessed more on-demand and streaming and electronic titles and services and movies and classes and courses that people can access now, that people can use to build on. The other thing to think about is the lifelong learning aspect. We have a lot of libraries who are out in the community, and they actually provide classes like ESOL classes where people can learn the actual language of this country so that they can have a better leg up when they go out to apply for jobs or participate in our society, whether it's helping their kids with schoolwork or whether they're applying for a different job. A lot of us think about story time sometimes as a cool time when you can show up and you can plop your kid in front of somebody who's going to read them a book for a little while, and then you get to look at Instagram or you get to look at a magazine for a little while. But when people come to story time, whether it's online as we're doing it now, or whether it's in person, which we'll hopefully get back to at some point, we're actually educating parents and children. The parents are learning about their role as educators in their child's life. This kid on the screen, this is Penny Conlon. She has the same last name as me. That's because she's my daughter. She's my second daughter. She just went to kindergarten this year. She's doing kindergarten online, and it's a hybrid model, so she goes into school now every other week. But as she prepared for kindergarten, we took the 1,000 Books Before Kindergarten Challenge, which many of our libraries help their communities and families in their communities to undertake. This is not something that I could have done realistically without access to the libraries. I'm pretty well compensated by Mid-Hudson. I had no complaints, especially with my boss on the line here, but 1,000 books is a lot of books. If I had to buy all of those and provide those to Penny, I wouldn't even known about the concept if it weren't for the children's programmers that I had worked with in the different libraries. And so Penny is just one kid, but there are many kids in the Hudson Valley and many families benefiting from this kind of education that we provide to people in all of our communities. The other thing that we do, or the other core value that comes out as a what, is the preservation that we provide. And in this case, preservation means accessibility, as we talked about before. So providing people with information they can actually use when they can use it. So that means providing them with the information they need, whether it's a book or other kind of information, in a format that they can use it. A lot of our ebooks have the advantage of being able to be increased in size, so they can be both large print and regular print. So that's a big accessibility highlight. The other thing about preservation is we're actually helping, in many cases, through our local history programs, or even just connecting people to actually talk about these things, is preserving the stories that make our communities and tell the stories about our communities. So many of us have local history collections where we gather things, and we've seen a lot of oral history projects that are coming out of COVID-19 now that many of us are using Zoom to record a lot of our programs and other recording platforms. So preservation is another key element of what we do in the library and another one of the services that we provide to our community.
That access to information that's local is really important. And if you think about local history collections in our libraries, where else are you going to get that information, right? We've got historical societies and libraries working hand in hand to make that accessible. And it really speaks to the whole idea of what is a community, what makes a community. And part of a community is bringing people together and finding ways forward together, problem solving together in a civic and civil society, and understanding how the community developed over time, who contributed to the health and wellness of that community, all ties back to information and respect of history. And I think that speaks to, again, the role of the trustee, that you've been entrusted with the public institution that is the public library. People trust you to spend tax dollars wisely on their behalf to create quality library service. They trust you with their own goodwill, that the library is an important institution. And so when we think about policymaking, it's really how you bring that trust to life, that you have policies in place that protect the assets of the library, that govern the experience that people will have when they come through the doors of your library. And I think it really speaks to how we live our values out loud. And one of the very first documents we wanted to show you a very specific example of is the Public Library Trustee Ethics Statement, which you can find on page 9 in your packet. And this, I think, is about the culture of your board, that you start off on the right foot from the very first day you come on the board, with understanding that there is a set of, let's say, operating rules or rules of engagement for how the board will conduct itself. And if we all agree to be an ethical board that will make good decisions on behalf of those we serve and not be swayed by business or partisan interests, that sets you off on a really solid path for making good decisions on behalf of your neighbors. So if your board doesn't have an ethics statement, and maybe you're newer on the board, or maybe you've been on the board for a while, you might want to suggest to your board president or your policies committee that you adopt an ethics statement that becomes part of the orientation process for new trustees on your board. Most of the time, people are just good people who want to do good work in their communities. It doesn't mean they necessarily understand what the role of a library trustee is. So when we come from the point of orientation for new trustees, we have the ability to shape that person's experience, which can help to contribute to a healthy culture on our boards. And so we do highly encourage library boards to adopt an ethics statement and to have trustees sign them either at the beginning of their term, or some boards in our system like to sign them every year as a little refresher to remind everyone to keep things professional and ethical. So in terms of an introduction to policymaking, I mentioned earlier that policies need to be written and board approved. And I say that with a twinkle in my eye, because a number of years ago, we started a project at the Mid-Hudson Library System called the Essential Documents Inventory, because we were challenged one year when our state library every year asks our library boards, do you meet the minimum standard of having policies at your library? And for many years, the state was very lax about this. They never even let you know what policies you were supposed to have. And then all of a sudden they got very serious about it and asked us, well, do your libraries have these policies? And we were like, ooh, we don't know, we hope so. So we did a project where we asked our libraries to share with us what policies they had in place. And in the first pass, I got a packet of materials back from a library in Ulster County. And the director told me, you know, some of these don't have a date, they didn't have dates on them when I found them. And they didn't match the list that I had given her. And so she told me that I said to her, you're going to have to go back and take a look at your board minutes to find out, were these actually board approved? Because nothing said board approved on them. I said, did you make this up? Did a staff person make this up? Does the board even know this exists? So she had to go and do this homework assignment to go back, read the board minutes. And she goes, well, it was very easy to know where to look in the archives of the board minutes, because the policies that I have that are handwritten, those were from the 1960s. Those that were from a typewriter, those were probably from the 60s or 70s. Those from the dot matrix printer, that was from the 1980s. And the ones from the laser printers, I knew those were the more recent board minutes to check out. So trust me when I say it's way easier just to put the date on them the day that you actually approve them or review them. And you are going to have to start tracking that with the new minimum standards that are going to go into effect on January 1st of next year, which require that all bylaws and policies of your library get reviewed at a minimum of every 5 years. So we actually have a tool on our website. It's a spreadsheet that matches the list of policies that you'll see at this workshop and in the trustee handbook that helps you track when policies were last reviewed, or perhaps if you don't have it, have a policy that is recommended or required, to get that on the docket of your policy committee, to get that in place in a timely manner, and we can help you prioritize which ones that you should be working on if you don't have them. So coming to the middle of this slide here, when you're doing policy making, what we're hoping is that you respect the guiding principles that we've covered here in the core values. And that goes back to the how slide, how we do this work. Ensuring access to information, respecting confidentiality and intellectual freedom, carrying forth our work with the ideas of social responsibility, service and professionalism, the public good, and a growing commitment to the idea of equity, diversity, and inclusion in the work of our libraries, from reflecting various cultures in our collections to inviting various cultures to be represented in our programming choices that we make, and understanding that the word minority does not mean today what it meant 40 years ago. So these ethos almost should be evident in the policymaking decisions that you're making to create the strongest possible library that will stand the test of time. Now, this third bullet that you see here might sound petty, but I will say it can help head off a lot of problems when you build in grievance procedures to your policies. So what I mean by that is, let's say that you have a patron code of conduct, which allows for what's acceptable behavior at the library by patrons. And just a reminder from Trustee Essentials, if you've attended that webinar with us, all libraries are what are called limited public forums, which means anyone can walk through your door, just like a shopping mall. But it doesn't mean people can behave any way they choose. You get to set the rules of behavior for the library. What is acceptable? What allows for an environment that provides the best possible experience for the maximum number of people in your community? Now, your library director and staff can tell you probably 100 hours worth of horror stories of patrons who have walked through their doors and not followed the patron code of conduct. And sometimes it's the patron's fault. And sometimes a staff person had a rough day and maybe took it out on a patron and booted them out for behavior that otherwise would have been acceptable in another situation. So for a patron to come back and say, well, I don't think I was treated fairly, there should be a mechanism in that policy that allows them to perhaps appeal being tossed out of the library or having their library privileges suspended for a certain amount of time. So that doesn't negate the staff's decision that they made, but it does allow for a reconsideration. Perhaps something was off in the decision a staff person made. I'll tell you though, more likely than not, the staff person usually made the right choice, given the situations that we find ourselves in public libraries. But you know, it comes into play in the back of house policies too. For example, your personnel policies. If there is a decision made that a staff person doesn't agree with or is having trouble with, what is their recourse? They often feel powerless in that situation, and sometimes a policy does lend itself to the idea of a grievance procedure, and we can point those out for you if that's something that you're interested in building in if it's not currently there. So this is the recommended policies checklist, and you might say to yourself, that font's awfully small. So we did print it out and put it in your handout packet, and you can see, I think it starts on page looks like 11 and 12 of your handout packet, and you'll be delighted to know that it's changed since we put it in your handout packet, because laws change all the time and change this list. So I can tell you that literally every year for the past 10 years, this list has changed in one way or another, whether it be that a law has changed or best practice has changed, or the Office of the State Comptroller has adjusted their best practices. So this is a constantly, let's say, evolving list, but we're going to work with what we have today. And so this list is organized in two categories: external policies and internal policies. You've got external policies that deal with basically the outward facing aspects of your library that the patrons interact with. You can see that, you know, comes into play at the circulation desk. It comes into play with your collection, with your programs, with your meeting room space, and with your technology. And the internal side of our business, which you can think of almost like in a restaurant or in theater, right? It's the back of house operations. It's the things that make everything actually work. It's how our board is run. It's how our administration and our library carries out day-to-day decision making. It's the financial controls that we put in place to help make sure we're protecting the financial assets of the library. And you'll see the longest area, the longest list in the policy checklist is under personnel. Our personnel, our library workers, are the most important asset of our libraries. And there's a long list of policies related to this aspect of our work, because not only are they humans, and there's a lot of things that happen when it comes to humans and in the workplace, but also because it could be the most litigious area of your library operations. When you take a look at the lawsuits that are brought against nonprofits in general, 90% of them fall into the area of human resources, someone who feels they were let go inappropriately or not treated fairly in the workplace. So personnel policies and financial control policies are extremely important when it comes to, I think, protecting the legal reputation of the library and protecting against litigation and costly court battles. Those are two areas that you want to have a very complete set of policies. Of course, I'm going to tell you here as the executive director of the Mid-Hudson Library System that you should have all of these policies, except, with of course exceptions. If maybe you don't have a local history collection, you wouldn't need a local history policy. But we just want to touch on a few policies here, and then we'll open up the floor for questions before we move on to our last segment of this evening. You've got a number of policies that are listed on this list that are required by law, and someday we're going to put little asterisks next to all the ones that are required by law, because those obviously are not optional. You'll have to comply with those. And good examples of those are like the example I gave you earlier this evening. On the external list under circulation, you see patron confidentiality, which we already mentioned. There's a law related to that, but you do need to have a policy related to law enforcement inquiry. Just because there's a law in place doesn't necessarily mean it explains how it plays out at the front desk of your library. So perhaps your policy deals with training for your staff on this topic. It lays out what to do if a staff person is approached by a member of law enforcement. It makes sure the director is empowered to do what they need to do to find that, fine line of helping the law enforcement officer who is trying to do their job too. They're trying to do the right thing by the community, but they may not be aware of the patron confidentiality law that we are operating under, which can create some tension between law enforcement and library staff. So a policy that's in place ahead of time that triggers training for your staff, a strong understanding by your library director of what to do if this situation arises, means that if it happens, on the off chance that it happens, because it's very, very rare, it might have a better chance of going smoothly and not resulting in tension with the law enforcement official that comes through the doors of the library. So it's not only legal protection for the library, but it's also confidence for your library staff that they know how to handle challenging but perhaps infrequent situations that may be confronted with in the day-to-day operations of the library. Others that are related to legal issues in the library, I'll move you down to the public space section of the external policy list. You'll see there at the top, accessibility/ADA statement. And I think I probably owe Casey a quarter because we've got an acronym on here that's not defined. If you're not familiar with ADA, it's the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a federal statute, which does mean your library needs to be fully accessible to people with disabilities. That might mean a physical disability that it makes it difficult for them to go upstairs to get into your building or into a certain area of your building. And there is a great myth out there that libraries that are older perhaps are what they called, there's a loophole that they don't have to comply with ADA. That's not true. I hate to burst anyone's bubble out there. You do need to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act, but it might not be feasible to do so overnight. And if you have an older library building, it might be a very costly fix to make sure your building is completely accessible. So by law, you need to have a statement that speaks to how you will provide equal access to services, even if your building is not fully accessible to all people in your community. I guarantee you this will be a growing issue in the coming years as we see a large amount of growth in the demographics of the older population in our communities, with more and more people want to age in place in the Hudson Valley. That is meaning that you will see a big growth expert in the demographics of senior citizens in our community that are looking for library services that might be challenged by some aspect of our buildings or the collections that we offer. Other legal ones that are on this list, we can move over to the internal side of things. On the board section, you're legally required to have a conflict of interest policy that meets the standard of New York State Not-for-Profit Revitalization Act law. And you might be thinking to yourself, oh my God, how am I supposed to know that? I'm not a lawyer. There's lots of resources to help your library with these types of things. There's sample policies on the Mid-Hudson website. You can see a link to that at the end of that list right there, that was actually produced by a lawyer who used to work for the New York Library Association. You might think to yourself, well, how do I know if my conflict of interest policy is as up to date as it needs to be? Because that law just changed in 2014. So a good clue is obviously the date at the end of your board approved policy, but also if you were asked to sign an annual financial disclosure form. If you were not, it's a good sign that your conflict of interest policy is out of step with current law. So other legal ones that are legally required as we look down the list here in administrative, you can see public access to records with another acronym, another quarter in the jar for me, that's not defined there, FOIL. You may be familiar with that phrase, but that's an acronym actually that stands for Freedom of Information Law that requires public libraries to, upon request, provide and furnish certain records to the public. Sometimes records that you might think should be private, maybe they have financial information about staff or information about a legal issue. There are very clear guidance from the New York State Archives and from New York State law of what records you legally must make accessible to the public upon request. So again, something you'd want to get right. If you can imagine the headlines, if someone puts a FOIL request in and your staff isn't aware that that's allowed or how to manage that when it comes in, that can result in some altercations with someone who's looking for information that legally they have a right to see. So again, it's that reputation that you're trying to protect in the long term. Under the financial controls area, everything that you see there, I would say that while not legally required, it is regulatorily required, particularly of public libraries. This is a list that's directly derived from the Office of the State Comptroller's best practices for internal financial controls. And for trustees of public libraries on the line, it's probably good to give you a heads up if you didn't know this already, that the Office of the State Comptroller can come knock on the door of your library and audit your library at any time. And they have a fun habit of every time they come to visit a library or another organization they're auditing of issuing a press release of their findings, which if your library is perhaps not on top of things and not following best practices to protect the public assets of your library, could result in some very unfortunate headlines. And I'm sure you're all thinking right now of similar headlines you may have seen for other organizations, perhaps in your own community or a neighboring community, when perhaps a village clerk or a fire district has been running afoul of some of these best practices and has lost public trust because compromised on keeping the money safe in their organization to a point where people were able to abscond with that money and use it personally. And that's the kind of headlines that it's very hard to recover the public trust after that. So making sure the assets are well protected and there's good solid financial controls in place is to everyone's benefit, from your library's perspective to the public's perception of how your library is run. On the personnel side of things, you've certainly got many intersections with law, from equal employment to harassment and jury duty to, let's say, recruitment and hiring practices and whistleblower protection. These are all aspects of personnel policy that have intersection with law. So again, I'm not going to assume that none of you on the call tonight are lawyers, but most people on library boards are not lawyers. But you have a lot of resources to help you. Your library probably has legal counsel where you can run policies by a lawyer. You have samples that are available to you, many of which have already been vetted by law. You have Casey and I who can help you think through an issue and avoid pitfalls that other libraries have fallen into. So lots of resources out there for you to brush up on policies, or if you discover that you're missing some policies, that we can help you fill in the blanks with. So already you might be thinking to yourself that there's probably two types of people on your board. Those that are like thinking right now, I hope I don't get named to the policy committee, and others that are like, ooh, I hope I get named to the policy committee. This sounds like fun. There's probably a clear division on your board of who likes to work on this kind of stuff and who doesn't. Just a programming note, if the financial control area is of interest to you, we do have a different webinar that's devoted just to the fiduciary responsibility of library boards, where we take a deeper dive on that front of things. And you'll find that we do webinars, and there's also recorded webinars on a variety of topics that take deeper dives on specific policies on this list. But this is a good example of an area where we're able to help you at your library at no charge to you when you give us a call to help for something like this. But I hope you're pleasantly surprised when you do an audit of which policies you have at your library, to see that libraries in our system at least have been working hard on this list for a long time. And while there's only 2 libraries in our system that we have confirmed have all of these policies in place, tons of our libraries are very close to having all of them. So as I said, you should be pleasantly surprised when you see the list of what you've got back at your library. Casey, was there anything else you wanted to talk on this checklist before we pause to open the floor for questions?
I think that's good so far. Just to reiterate that, you can contact Rebecca or I if you have any questions. We often find ourselves talking about minimum standards and policies for longer than we ought to, even longer than we have to. So it's something that we enjoy doing. So please, don't hesitate to reach out to us.
I made a note here that the newest law that will be added to this list that you see is in the area of safety, which on Labor Day, the governor signed into law a requirement, at least for public libraries, to have a pandemic response plan. So that will be a new one your directors will probably be talking to you at your very next board meeting about. Association libraries, while not required to have that, many directors are choosing to put that in play anyway, because it organizes a lot of the good thinking you've done over the past 8 months to help manage the pandemic at your library. So Casey, I'm going to pause here and see if any questions have come through that we might want to tackle before we move on.
So if anybody has any questions, please pop them in the chat box or the question box. We did have one question from Claudia, and she was just wondering how to get a hard copy, and I provided her with the info so that she could contact Joan, and everybody should be able to see that in the question box now. If anybody has any other questions, then, oh, here we go, we got one now. If a library has a policy but it's not dated, would it be a good idea to read the policy aloud at the next meeting and repass it?
I would say it would, instead of just automatically reading it, maybe giving it back over to the policy committee to see if there's any upgrades that are obviously needed, to see if there's any recommendations for that. But if not, the committee could then say to the board in their committee report that they've reviewed this policy and they recommend that it be approved or renewed by the committee. So I would recommend mediation by your policy committee to save some time there.
But that would be a good habit and a good thing to start thinking about anyway. As we pointed out before, all of the library's policies will have to be reviewed every 5 years according to the new minimum standards.
And I think that that's a good point, Casey, that you don't want to do all of these in the same year. So staggering that over the course of the 5 years would be very helpful. So maybe the first pass by the policy committee is to see the dates on everything and record it in the spreadsheet that we have on our website that matches this checklist, and figure out what your rolling pattern will be for that review structure, so that people don't feel overwhelmed or that you have to devote like an entire board meeting just to reviewing policies.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I don't see any other questions right now, but everybody is welcome to put them into the question box or the chat box. There's some privacy features in there. You can send them privately to us, and we can make sure your name isn't on there. But again, as I said before, if there's not something you want to ask today, you can always reach out to us after the webinar as well, by email or by phone.
And we definitely respect the fact that some of the things you may want to ask are sensitive to your particular library or a particular issue with your staff or your finances. So as Casey said, please feel free to reach out. That's literally what we're here for. So please don't hesitate. So Casey, we're ready for the next segment?
Yeah, I think we should dive right in.
All right, cool, let's do it.
All right, so now is the interactive part of the presentation today, where you get to play along at home as if you were a library trustee confronted with a difficult scenario, which is drawn from one of our case studies. So I'm going to read this question aloud, and then I encourage you, if you feel comfortable, to provide what you think is the answer from the multiple choice that we have below into the chat or question box. So, first question is, the board president receives an email from a patron demanding that the Harry Potter series be removed from the library's collection due to their belief that the series promotes witchcraft and sorcery. So what should the board president's first step be? And we have a couple options here. So if you're feeling like you know what the answer is, please pop it into the chat box or the question box. Welcome to play along at home. Oh, we have a D has come in. Oh, we got some people say maybe C. C might be good. Invite the patron to the next board meeting to share their opinion on the titles. And D is refer them to the library's policy on collection development and ask them to fill out the library's request for reconsideration form. And we have somebody here. We have a B. Oh no, that's a before or after they stop laughing. That comes in from one of our folks there. So. All right. So Rebecca, you want to tell us? Oh, there it is.
Right, so the answer is actually D. Hopefully your library has this collection development policy and a standard way to manage this, because it's not, let's say, uncommon, but it's certainly infrequent that this type of thing happens. But the American Library Association has a model request for reconsideration form, which it really helps to have the person who's making a complaint fully articulate their concern about the title or item in the collection that they find objectionable for whatever particular reason it is, right? We certainly want to be respectful towards patrons that have concerns, but we also want them to fully articulate their concern. It's not just their opinion. It should be that they've actually read the item, and it's, you know, they need to have a solid case for why they think it should be removed. But it's certainly not their personal decision of whether or not it gets removed from the collection. Someone made a comment about, you know, laughing at something like this, but if you take a look at the top books that are challenged in the United States, Harry Potter consistently makes the top 10 list of books that are challenged in our country. So when you think about the balance of what could have happened if early on in the history of the Harry Potter books, a challenge came through and these books became censored in our libraries, there would literally be millions of children who did not read these books, that did not have the experience of understanding the message in these books, which helps to empower children to understand the world around them and to fight for what they think is right. And that would be a very sad thing for our society to have lost overall. And that's why we don't have decisions about the collection being in the hands of perhaps only one person from our community who may or may not be fully informed about the particular item they're concerned about. So that request for reconsideration form, it asks them to take some time, write out their concern, and follow the process in your policy. Perhaps the first stop is with your director, who considers the complaint they've received. And now your director has possibly been the person who purchased that item or certainly oversaw the staff that purchased that item. And they can help to say, well, you know, that follows our collection development policy. Perhaps we have a popular reading collection that we develop as per our policy, and I used the standard sources to find the titles that we ended up putting into our collection. And sometimes you'll find that maybe you had a rogue staff person who bought an item that was self-published by their cousin, and maybe it is a little off the beaten path and isn't quite fitting with the library's culture and collection development, and maybe does need to be reconsidered in terms of the full body of the collection that you're trying to develop. But I think, you know, answer D would supersede answer C, because it helps that person think through their answer before they get in front of your board to talk about this issue. Now, if they had filed the request for reconsideration form and the director came back back and said, I don't agree with your challenge, we're going to keep this item in the collection, there might be a grievance procedure for that patron to say, well, I'm not satisfied with that, I want to go to the board with that issue. And that might result in a public hearing at a board meeting about this topic. But inviting a random person from your community to eat up the valuable time at your board meeting, which the purpose of your board meeting is to do the business of the library, which is on the agenda and helps keep things moving well, that might not be the first stop for someone who's unhappy with something with your collection. But again, if you need to escalate that situation, a public hearing at a board meeting over the topic where you're shining the full light of day on the issue, that might come into play at a later stage in that process. All right, ready for the next one?
Yep, I think so. Everybody ready at home? All right. All right, so in the second scenario, we have the director approaches a patron who is not wearing a mask in the library and asks them to don a mask and points to a copy of the library's board-approved policy, which requires a mask to be worn at all times while in the library facility. The patron refuses and storms out of the library. The patron contacts the board to complain that their constitutional rights are being trampled by the library director's insistence that they wear a mask while in the library. What should the board president's first step be? So we have somebody who's chimed in with D. We got a lot of D's here. A lot of D's
Very
coming.
fresh topic.
Yeah.
They probably considered it pretty recently at a board meeting.
Yeah. All right, we got a lot of D. D seems to be the winner on this one.
All right, ding, 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 ding. We've got winners on our audience here. This is obviously a super timely issue that I know many of you have truly had to think through already on your boards this year. Very tough topic earlier on as libraries started to reopen at the top of the summer, but it's something that I think is uncomfortable for staff, but also has intersection with state guidance and state law, which is, I think, helpful, obviously, in this situation when people are getting very concerned and perhaps very irate about this topic. So the fact that we've got a board-approved policy in the hypothetical is fantastic, right? The director's got something to stand on when confronting somebody about that. But we've also have directors that are doing an excellent job of finding alternative access to services. So we still want to preserve that patron's right to access library services, but if they're committed to not wearing a mask, we have to be committed to public health and public safety as well. So they may need to find an alternative way to access services with the help of the library staff. Or they could, maybe put a mask on and come into the library and use services the way other patrons are in our community, which I think is reasonable, right? You're willing to say to them that we'll meet you halfway and make sure you have access, but you are going to have to comply with either wearing a mask or using an alternative path to access those services. So it still respects that core value of access to service. All right, here's our next one. Oh, Casey, you still there?
Sorry. So, all right. So in this scenario, the board receives a written complaint from a parent of a 13-year-old that the library staff refused to answer their inquiry as to what library materials their teenager had checked out on the teenager's own card. The staff refused. The patron then complained to the director, who also refused to reveal what the teenager had checked out. What should the board's response be? Have Claudia was quick on the draw with a D. We have Mark Wilson, he's giving us a D. I'm seeing more Ds. I'm seeing a lot of Ds come in.
All right, we've got some very motivated trustees here this evening. So correct, D is correct again. Approve a written response from the board president that provides the patron with the library's patron privacy and confidentiality policy. I may have stacked the deck on this one tonight. And the citation in New York state law that protects the privacy of their teenagers' library use. I think I might have let it slip earlier in the evening that the New York state law related to patron confidentiality does not speak to the age of the patron. It's for all patrons with their own library card. card. And it certainly creates some absurd situations in our libraries. If you've got perhaps a 4-year-old that very proudly got their own library card and then promptly lost one of their library books their parents helped them take out with their brand spanking new library card, and you've got just a harried mom who just needs to know what to look for in the house, it quickly becomes silly. But as children get older, it becomes less and less silly and far more serious, particularly when a teenager may be exploring an issue that's very sensitive or perhaps not in line with their parents' values. That can be a very uncomfortable situation for the teenager. And so the library staff's ability to help that teenager protect their privacy is certainly guaranteed by law, but could create some tough situations at the front desk if a patron is choosing to put the staff in between the situation with their child. So I think this very measured approach is a great example of why you need to have the policy in place before these types of things happen, so we know what to do and we can de-escalate tough situations at the front desk of the library.
Okay, you did give that one away earlier.
I did, I'm sorry. So it's either that or they figured out the D answer pattern that we ended up doing inadvertently there.
Could be.
All right.
Good job,
So
everybody.
yeah, excellent job. Super impressed here. So our last kind of talking point here, and then we'll open the floor to questions again if people have lingering issues they'd like to discuss tonight, is evaluating policy. We just mentioned a couple of times that the new minimum standards going into effect in January require policies to be reviewed every 5 years. And that minimum standard was put into place because we had so many libraries that just forgot they had policies, that weren't updating them when laws changed. So that's the very first thing we're looking for when you're evaluating a policy. Is it in compliance with all laws and regulations? And something Mid-Hudson staff, Casey and I in particular, choose to do, we're not required to do it, but we choose to do it, is we're constantly scanning for changes in laws and regulations that might impact library policy. And we do our best to let your directors know about that in our reports to them through the Directors Association, at directors briefings that we hold related to COVID, in the bulletin that you might sign up for that comes out every week. We try to institute those kinds of learnings on our website whenever possible. So we do aim to be your partner in that work, because we know not every library has a lawyer on retainer, but there are definitely policies that you will want to retain your own legal counsel to review to make sure it fits the needs of your library and your particular situation. The other thing to take a look at is to make sure policies are consistent with the library's charter, mission, goals, and plans. And this comes into play far more likely in the external category of policies, in terms of making sure that if your strategic plan, let's say, for example, you've got a goal to increase programming for the public. And this, again, is probably a pre-COVID example I'm using in the before times. When you're inviting people into your programming space or your meeting space, it might mean that if you previously had a meeting space policy that locked down access to your library's meeting space only for library programming, and then your new plan has a goal to have more people coming together at the library to meet, you might change that policy to allow for community groups to reserve the library's meeting space, in addition to it being used by library triggered programs that are being put on by the staff. That's just one example of how a policy might need to evolve over time, given plans that may change at the library. We'd really love to see your policies be consistent with Library Bill of Rights and the Freedom to Read Statement, which is the second handout in your handout packet tonight. Right after the Library Bill of Rights, you'll find the Freedom to Read Statement. And this is a very unique statement that has evolved over time and has been developed with help from the American Library Association, in addition to the publishing industry, which I find very interesting. If you're a policy wonk like me, it's very cool to read the history behind some of these documents that have evolved in the profession. But these are two things that many library boards actually adopt as part of their policy manual. You'll often see when you flip through a library's policy manual, the Library Bill of Rights and Freedom to Read, and sometimes even the Freedom to View statement, actually adopted by a local library board. So it helps to guide decision-making and policy issues that come up at the library. The other thing to evaluate for is a policy complete, clearly written, and easily understandable. And I can't tell you how many times we've been asked to help out at a library, and we sit down and we read their policy, and I have to ask, I'm not sure what you meant by this clause. And the library director will look at it and be like, well, I don't understand it either. I had this trustee who wrote it, and we all just went with it. And then we go back and we ask the trustee, oh, what did you mean by this one? And they're like, I just cut and pasted it from some library out in Wisconsin. And the truth is, we didn't dig down deep enough to make sure it actually made sense and worked for our situation. So sometimes that happens, right? It's just the nature of getting work done in a volunteer environment. But that's a great thing to review for when you take a look at your policies. And then, of course, we want to make sure that our policies are in the best interest of the community at large. And this is an example, unfortunately, that's very current, that we're seeing some unfortunate decisions being made in other parts of the country related to collections and access to technology and spaces that are being very heavily influenced by politics. And that's something that I think we have to protect against, that we make sure that we're truly doing well for all people in our community, regardless of their political affiliation. And that can be a sensitive issue sometimes, particularly if the makeup of the library board is at the opposite end of the spectrum of the political makeup of perhaps a town board or a school board. You can find sometimes there's tension in those areas. So doing our best to rise above sometimes the politics of the day, but always being very aware and sensitive to the politics of the day when making decisions about policy in our libraries. Then the issue of the actual application of our policies, especially the ones that are externally facing, your staff are the ones that have to carry them out, not you. So making sure that you get the input from staff at the policy committee level. You've obviously got your library director 100% of the time at the table with you when you're working on staff, and they often are the ones who draft policy to bring to the table for your consideration. That's the normal way that work gets done. And that makes sure that the library staff is represented in the policy as well when they're the ones that have to carry something out. So not making policies or procedures overly cumbersome for library staff. You want them straightforward, clear, and again, not I think I just used this phrase already, but overly burdensome. I think about that one a lot because I've definitely inherited library policy in some situations where a smaller library perhaps adopts a policy model they found from a very large metropolitan library. And as you can imagine, the situations that are perhaps a rural library staff are confronted with are quite a bit different than what happens at the Los Angeles Public Library. So we always want to make sure we're testing for reality at our libraries, given the communities that we serve and the makeup of our communities. And always thinking at the back of our mind, are our policies designed to maximize access for the greatest number of users? And I think we definitely have people that sometimes are drawn to our profession that love rules. And maybe you love rules too. Maybe you're a trustee who comes from a background and you love rules too, and that's not a bad thing at all. We're not denigrating it, but we do have to question sometimes why we put rules in place. Is it to truly enhance the experience of people at the library or to protect the assets of the library? Or do we get a little too excited about telling people what to do? And sometimes we go a little overboard in that. And that is definitely the case sometimes, particularly with our patron codes of conduct, where we start putting more and more no statements in there because of one incident at the library, when truthfully that it's something that probably will never happen again. So I definitely question very long patron codes of conduct. They usually are a sign that you've got a little too much in there. Believe it or not, one of the best policies I've ever seen related to patron code of conduct was at a very special library down in North Carolina, Charlotte, North Carolina. If anyone's visited there, you might be aware that they not only have a public library that looks very much like the public libraries up here in New York, they have a whole separate building that is just a library for teenagers. And as a lot of staff will tell you, that's an awesome thing, right? Because they can be loud and boisterous and they have different needs than a lot of the other populations that we serve. But I remember the first time I visited that library and I was really amazed. They had this whole space just for teens. And I took a look at the sign on the wall that was the patron code of conduct, and it was literally only 3 lines long. I'm like, how could that possibly be? Teens are always acting out in our spaces. But the 3 lines were respect yourself, respect others, respect the space. And when you really get down to it, that's all we need people to do, is to have some self-respect, respect the needs of others in that space, and respect the institution and the facility. So when you really think about it in those terms, you don't need to itemize every possible thing someone could do in acting out. And if you've got one of those policies, it really might be time to upgrade that and rethink the message you're sending with that policy, because it's very uninviting to staff, I'm sorry, to patrons, and really gives them the sense that you might not actually really want them there. And that's not the kind of vibe we want to put out there about our libraries. So just a couple of tips there for you as you evaluate policies in the coming months and years. So Casey, I wonder if any other questions came through while I was going on and on about evaluating policies.
Oh, everybody was riveted, so we haven't seen any questions yet. But I wanted to tell everybody that if they do have questions, please put them in the question box, or you can put them in the chat box. You can send them privately, or you can do them publicly there. We did have one question that came in while we were doing the case studies. There was more of a comment from Priscilla, and she was saying that to maybe thank the person for sharing their concern before referring them to the collection policy.
Yeah, I think that's
regarding the Harry Potter book.
Yeah, excellent point. And I hope I did convey that you want to treat someone with respect when they come in and have a concern, and not to be dismissive, right? We don't want our staff to laugh them off or not take them seriously when they come in, because they've obviously been concerned enough that they're taking action. And I think we can all think of times in our life where we were grumbly about something or dissatisfied about something, but it had to meet a pretty high test to actually make us go and take action and file a complaint about something. So taking that person seriously, that's part of why we refer people to the request for reconsideration form. And as Priscilla noted, thanking someone to care enough to bring that concern to the library's attention. While 99% of the time their concerns are perhaps religious or are politically motivated, there certainly have been cases where something's been called out in a collection that just got by the staff. Maybe they got a recommendation from a local patron, bought something without evaluating it themselves, and perhaps it was a little overboard. So it can be a very subjective thing, how someone perceives something in your collection, but everybody that comes to your library deserves respect, and particularly those that have complaints to bring to the attention of the library staff. So excellent comment. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I don't see any other questions right now, and we don't have anything else in the chat. But I will reiterate that if you have any other questions after this, or if just something you didn't want to ask today, please contact us by phone or by email. Oh, we have another question. It says, thank you, Rebecca and Casey, for the excellent program. Sessions are always helpful and good reminders of what trustees need to know and govern their libraries effectively. So it's not a question, but that's still appreciated, Mark.
Certainly very nice to end the evening on that. We would like to thank you for taking the time to come to the webinar this evening. As we always say, we know you have many choices of what to do with your time, and it means a lot to us that you're taking the time to learn more about your role as a public library trustee. And as always, we profoundly thank you for your service to your local library. You are what makes local libraries so special, that they're governed by neighbors, and that makes our library so special to those that they serve. So thank you very much, and we hope you have a good evening and enjoy the World Series if that's where you're headed next.